Have you ever sat quietly and wondered when it started? When the soft shifts in tone, the sighs, the half-laughs, the dismissive comments began to replace the warmth and respect that used to live in your relationship with your children. It's not that they yell or curse or storm out the door. No, it's more subtle than that. And somehow that makes it hurt even more. The eye roll when you speak, the way they interrupt or ignore your stories, the sarcastic comments passed off as jokes, the way they sigh when you ask a question as if your presence is inconvenient. You sit there after they've left the room or ended the call, and a part of you wilts. You replay what was said. You wonder if you were too sensitive. You tell yourself it wasn't meant that way, but still you feel it. That slow, quiet erosion of dignity. And you ask yourself, when did my voice become background noise? When did I stop being seen as a person and start being seen as someone to tolerate? That's not the legacy you hoped for. That's not the role you built your life around. You gave your love freely. You worked hard, stayed up late, worried endlessly, made sacrifices no one will ever fully understand. You didn't do it for thanks. You did it because you loved them. Because you believed that kindness would be remembered. That the warmth you gave would one day come back to you. But now, in these later years, you sit across the dinner table or behind the phone line and wonder, why do I feel like I don't matter anymore? Let me say something gently but clearly. You are not imagining it. Subtle disrespect is real, and it leaves bruises where no one can see them. But here's the most important truth I want to share with you today. You are not powerless. You are not trapped. And you are absolutely not too old to speak your truth and be treated with the dignity you deserve. It doesn't take shouting. It doesn't take confrontation. Sometimes it only takes a sentence. A quiet sentence that says, I noticed what you just said, and I value myself enough to respond differently this time. Let me tell you about Lorraine. Lorraine is 72. Sharp-witted, warm-hearted, and someone who never wanted to cause trouble. Her son David loved her, but over the years he had begun to treat her more like a household convenience than a person. When she offered advice, he brushed it off. When she shared stories from her past, he'd glance at his phone or change the subject. It wasn't cruel. It wasn't loud. But it cut deep in that way only the quiet kind of neglect can. One day after she'd reminded him twice about locking the gate, something important to her, he sighed loudly and said, Mom, I got it. You don't need to say it 3 times. Lorraine felt the old instinct rise, the urge to smile, to laugh it off, to stay agreeable. But this time she looked at him gently and said, You know, when you speak to me like that, it makes me feel small. And I've lived too long and loved you too deeply to accept that kind of tone. There was silence. David looked up. Really looked at her. I didn't mean it that way, he said. She smiled softly. I know. But that doesn't mean it didn't hurt. It wasn't a lecture. It wasn't a demand. It was a truth spoken from a place of self-worth. And from that day forward, something changed. Not instantly. But the way he addressed her became more mindful, softer. He began to catch himself, and Lorraine, without anger or bitterness, had shown him how to see her again. That's the power of gentle boundaries. You don't have to fight for respect. You have to model it. You have to stand inside your own sense of value, not with pride or defensiveness, but with grace. Because you are not fragile. You are not needy. You are someone who has lived and lost and learned, and that deserves reverence. I know it's hard, especially when you've spent your whole life making others comfortable, when you've been the peacemaker, when you were taught that speaking up is selfish or disrespectful. But there comes a moment often in the quietest hour when your heart whispers, I don't want to feel this way anymore. And that moment can be your turning point. Let me share another story. Harold is 78. A quiet man, soft-spoken, always accommodating. His daughter, a successful executive, had developed the habit of speaking to him like he was a forgetful child. "Dad, I already told you that," she'd say. Or, "Let me handle it, you wouldn't understand." Each time Harold smiled and nodded. Until one afternoon, as she corrected him in front of her children, something inside him stirred. Not anger, just a calm resolve. Later that evening, he sat beside her and said, "You know, I may not have your education or career, but I built a home with these hands. I raised you with love. I've earned more than being spoken to like I'm a burden. Please remember that." She stared at him. Something in her expression softened. For the first time in a long while, she touched his hand and said, "I'm sorry." That one sentence didn't just restore Harold's dignity. It taught his daughter something she hadn't even realized she'd forgotten, that her father was still a man worthy of respect. These are the quiet revolutions that happen not with shouting, but with stillness, with words chosen from strength, with the decision to no longer play small. And sometimes all it takes is saying something simple. "I don't like the way that sounded. That didn't feel respectful to me. I want to feel heard when I speak, not to shame, not to scold, but to remind them and maybe even yourself that you are still here, still wise, still worthy of being spoken to with love. Because you are." It's strange how the little things can wear us down the most. Not the big arguments, not the open insults, just the slow drip of being overlooked, interrupted, brushed aside. It happens in the smallest moments when you're telling a story, and they glance at their phone when they say, yeah, before you finish your sentence, or when they treat your opinion like it's outdated before even hearing it. You tell yourself not to take it personally, that they're stressed, that the world has changed, that you're just being sensitive. But deep inside, something starts to harden. Not anger, not quite, but a kind of sadness. A quiet grieving for the connection you once had. And the worst part is you start to question yourself. Am I annoying? Am I out of touch? Should I just stay quiet? No, you shouldn't. Because respect isn't just about how loudly someone speaks. It's about whether or not they still see your value. And if you let yourself fade, if you shrink to avoid discomfort, you send the unspoken message that it's okay to overlook you. But it's not. Let me tell you about Margaret. She's 74 and had always been the gentle presence in her family, the one who let others speak first, who never raised her voice. Her daughter Emily had begun taking control of everything: finances, appointments, even decorating Margaret's living space without asking. It wasn't cruel, it was subtle. But it felt suffocating. One day, as Emily showed up with bags of new curtains, Margaret smiled, took her daughter's hands and said, "I love how much you care. But I want you to remember I'm still here. I still have opinions, and I'd like to choose my own curtains." Emily was surprised. Not offended, surprised. She hadn't realized what she was doing. She'd mistaken care for control. But Margaret's gentle honesty opened a door. It takes bravery to speak up like that, especially after years of swallowing your discomfort. But the moment you do, you reclaim something precious, your voice. And here's something you may need to hear. You don't owe anyone silence to keep their comfort intact. Respect starts with how you treat yourself. If you constantly bend to keep the peace that becomes your role, not because you deserve it, but because you've trained people to expect it. Frank, who's 79, was always the easy one. His adult son would cancel plans, dismiss his thoughts, and talk over him during family dinners. Frank never made a fuss, but each time he felt smaller. Until one afternoon, while sitting with his son at the park, Frank paused mid-conversation and said softly, "When you interrupt me, it makes me feel like my thoughts aren't important. And I want you to know they are. I've lived a long time. I have something to say." His son blinked. The silence between them was thick, But then, something changed. The next time they spoke, Frank noticed it. His son waited, listened, asked follow-up questions. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. Not because Frank scolded him, but because Frank stood in his dignity. You don't have to argue to create respect. You don't have to defend yourself in long-winded speeches. You only need to hold your space. Start with a breath, a pause, and then a sentence like, "I'm not finished speaking." That felt a bit dismissive. Please don't speak to me that way. Short, calm, clear. Not from anger, but from a quiet belief that you deserve better. Because here's the thing. Subtle disrespect often isn't about you. It's about patterns, habits. People get used to taking shortcuts in how they treat others, especially those they assume will always be there. But when you gently interrupt that pattern, you teach them how to relate to you with more presence, more care, more honor. And that change doesn't just affect you, it shifts the entire dynamic. Lorraine, who we talked about earlier, noticed that once she began calmly pointing out the moments where her son's tone felt harsh, he didn't just soften with her. He softened with his own children. He became more aware of how he spoke to everyone, because respect is contagious. When we hold ourselves with calm authority, others begin to do the same. But this can only happen when you choose not to retreat into silence, when you choose not to accept subtle disrespect as a normal part of aging. You are not here to be tolerated. You are not background noise in someone else's life. You are still a parent, a person, a soul with depth and wisdom. You are not old and obsolete. You are seasoned and sacred. And when you carry that truth in how you speak, how you walk, how you respond, you don't have to demand respect. You become it. So the next time your child sighs or jokes at your expense or rushes you through a story, take a breath. Look them in the eye and say something real. You're not asking for permission. You're offering them a chance to do better, and most of the time they will. Not because you forced it, but because your presence reminded them of something they'd forgotten. That you are still someone to be honored. Something happens when you stop accepting subtle disrespect and begin to speak from a place of calm confidence. It's not always dramatic. There's no applause, no tearful hugs. But something shifts first in the air, between you, then in their eyes, and finally in how they carry themselves around you. Because when you reclaim your voice, your presence begins to take up its rightful space again. And sometimes that alone is enough to remind them that you are still their parent. Not a relic of who you once were, not a convenient listener, not a fixture in the background, but someone still rooted in wisdom, still worthy of being looked at with soft eyes. Helen, who's 77, told me about a moment with her daughter that had quietly restored their relationship. For years, she'd put up with little dismissals, being told she wouldn't understand, being asked not to give advice, being laughed off when she brought up her own ideas. It hurt, but she smiled through it. Until one day, they were talking about parenting, and Helen offered a thought. Her daughter cut her off mid-sentence with a casual, "That's not how things work anymore, Mom." And instead of going silent or nodding like she usually did, Helen simply said, "It may not be how you do things now, but it worked well for me. And I'd appreciate if you didn't dismiss it so quickly." There was no anger in her voice, no edge, just quiet honesty. The room went still. Her daughter blinked, then slowly said, "You're right, Mom. I didn't mean to sound like that." That moment became a turning point. Not because it changed everything instantly, but because it reminded both of them that love and respect must live together. And here's the quiet truth. No one tells you sometimes your children don't even realize how they've started treating you. Life gets busy, stress builds, habits form, and slowly the roles shift until you're no longer the authority figure but someone they speak to without care, without pause. But when you begin showing up differently, When you stop shrinking, when you start naming how things make you feel, they begin to see you again. Not through the lens of obligation, but with fresh eyes. And something else happens too. You begin to see yourself differently. You stop waiting for approval. You stop hoping for the perfect moment to be heard. You begin walking through your days with a little more pride, a little more stillness in your step. You realize that you don't need to be praised to feel valuable. You only need to stop betraying yourself to stay easy. That's what Frank discovered. He started doing small things differently. He dressed up a bit more, even just to go to the store. He spoke more slowly, made direct eye contact, and stopped letting himself be talked over. When his son made a sarcastic remark at dinner, Frank didn't laugh it off like he usually did. He simply looked at him and said, "That joke felt like it was at my expense. That's not how I'd like us to talk to each other." It wasn't a demand. It wasn't drama. It was truth, and it changed something. His son paused, looked a little embarrassed, then nodded. "You're right, Dad. I'm sorry." Because when you stop allowing the small slights, the little digs, the passing dismissals, you give your children a gift, a chance to do better, a chance to rise into who they can be, and they often do. Not because you forced them, but because your calm, consistent self-respect asked them to meet you at a higher level. But here's something even more important. Even if they don't change right away, or ever, you are still allowed to change the way you respond. You can choose to detach from the guilt. You can let go of the idea that speaking up is unkind. You can stop believing that respect is something you have to earn at this stage in your life. You've already earned it. By being here. By living this long. By carrying the weight of generations on your back and still showing up with love. You don't need to be loud to be heard. You don't need to shout to command respect. You just need to stand softly in your truth. Over and over again. Until the people around you adjust, not because you scolded them, but because they feel the shift in you. That shift is real. It's in how you walk, in how you speak, in how you smile, not to be agreeable, but because you feel peace in your own skin. It's in how you stop explaining yourself, how you stop laughing at jokes that hurt, how you stop saying it's okay when it's really not. And the beautiful thing is, when you stop chasing respect, it often finds its way back to you. Because dignity has a weight to it, a presence, a quiet beauty that makes people pause. Not everyone will notice, but the right people will. And more importantly, you will. You'll feel stronger, calmer, clearer. You'll walk through your home not as someone waiting to be appreciated, but as someone who knows their own worth. And that is the kind of strength that no one, not even your own children, can take away from you. If you're still here with me, I want you to know how deeply that matters. Thank you for your time, for your openness, and for sitting through a conversation that probably touched some tender places inside you. It's not easy to look at the relationships that mean the most to us and admit when something's off, when it hurts, when the love is there but the respect is missing in the quiet ways. But what you've done today is powerful. You didn't turn away from the discomfort. You faced it with courage. And maybe, just maybe, you're beginning to see that you are not helpless in this story. That your presence still carries weight. That your voice still deserves to be heard. So many older adults live with unspoken pain, the pain of being seen as old instead of wise, as needy instead of valuable. The pain of being talked over, dismissed, brushed aside by the very people they once carried through sleepless nights and endless worries. But here's something I want to say from my heart to yours. You don't have to tolerate subtle disrespect to keep the peace. You don't have to stay small to feel loved. You don't have to accept half-hearted connection just because you're afraid of being alone. You are allowed to want more. Not more attention, not more drama, just more respect, more presence, more care in the way people speak to you, listen to you, and relate to you. And if this message helped you remember that, if it stirred something in you, if it made you feel less alone or gave you the words you've been searching for, I'd love for you to share your story in the comments. Have you experienced subtle disrespect from your children or others close to you? Have you found a way to respond that helped shift the relationship in a better direction? Even just writing it down, saying it out loud, can be healing. And you never know who else might be comforted by reading your words. And if this message made you feel seen, if it reminded you of your quiet strength, I'd be honored if you clicked subscribe. Not for numbers, not for algorithms, but because this space is built for you, for people who are still growing, still living, still deserving of truth and tenderness at any age. You are not too old to be respected. You are not too quiet to be heard. You are not too late to change the energy in your relationships. You're still here, and that matters more than you know. So the next time someone speaks to you with a tone that makes you shrink, take a breath. Look them in the eye and say what your heart has been waiting to say. You don't need to fight for love. You only need to stand in your light. Thank you for being here, and thank you for being you, always.